Hello everyone, Karnasa here, and welcome to For All Kerbalkind, a collaborative RP-1 series between TheBeardyPenguin, N9Gaming, and now myself. This will be my introduction to the series, however I'm joining midway through, so if you haven't already seen what Beardy and N9 have been up to, I'd highly recommend going and checking out their previous videos. I'll be starting in January 1964 as the Commonwealth Space Commission, a group of countries who have decided to join forces under leadership of the United Kerbdom to bring their individual nations into this new age and try and establish some sort of presence in space. The Australians have very kindly lent the Commission some land in the outback. Woomera Air Force Base, now known as Woomera Space Centre, will be where the majority of early launches take place. As mentioned, I will be starting later on, but in order to not fall behind the others, my start will be boosted. I'll begin with 350 science, which is enough to unlock nearly all of the tech that I could purchase from the level 1 R&D building, with only one solid rocket engine node missing. I'll also be starting with a level 2 R&D building so that I can begin researching new technology as soon as I gain enough science to unlock new nodes. The 350 science gave me 18 build points in Kerbal construction time to spend, which I have allocated 15 to my build queue and 3 to my R&D, as initially I want to be churning out vehicles as quickly as possible. It will take me a while to gain enough science to begin researching anything new, so I decided that getting my build rates up would be the most important way to spend my points. Apart from this, I will have nothing extra from a normal RP1 start. Every other building is level 1 and I'll have 50,000 funds, the same as the Soviets and the US had to begin with. Introductions aside, it's now time to actually begin. First things first, I need to pick up the first launch contract, which gives me just enough funds to build my first vessel, the de Havilland 108. Having quite a bit of tech to choose from, I decided to kick things off with a supersonic plane. However, unlocking the jet engine, intakes, and supersonic wings required much more money than a simple sounding rocket, leaving me with not even 3k in the bank. So, on the 22nd of February 1964, the Commonwealth Space Commission starts its journey in this series with the de Havilland 108. The de Havilland 108B, I'm not entirely sure where the B came from, but we do have two of our crew on board. We have Geoffrey Kerman and Peter Kerman. However, they will be getting renamed to Geoffrey and Peter D. Kerman at a later point in order to avoid any confusion with their distant US cousin Peter Kerman over in the States. The De Kerman brothers' mission is rather simple today though. Break the speed of sound and try and launch the Skylark strapped on to the bottom of this vehicle, which went rather successfully, but honestly I didn't want to leave this unattended for too long, so after getting just shy of 10 kilometers away from the de Havilland 108, I decided to switch back in order to avoid this craft from disappearing forever and killing my first two Kerbals that I had launched. After launching the rocket not very high though, I decided to do a little bit of aerobatics and fly around and do some loop-de-loops and, you know, all of that cool stuff that you can do in supersonic planes. I did break the speed of sound in this, however, it wasn't going to count towards the contract because obviously I have not picked that up yet. No, I need to fly this again and we will be doing that shortly. Although I want to kind of say about Geoffrey and Peter de Kerman in this plane. They are named after the de Havilland brothers, Geoffrey and Peter de Havilland. There was a third, I can't remember what he was called though, and they were the sons of another Geoffrey de Havilland, who actually was the guy that ran the company that built this and also built quite a lot of different planes, and not just planes either. I believe it was the de Havillands that were also somewhat responsible for the Blue Streak intercontinental ballistic missile, so the first stage of the Europa. But I am getting ahead of myself there. We will be talking about that a little bit later on. Well, Geoffrey Kerman certainly fared a lot better than his in real life counterpart in that flight because that plane actually killed him. It is the first ever supersonic British jet, which is why I wanted to use it, but no, it had a bit of a iffy history, and so I don't think I'm going to be using it an awful lot in this series either. But with that, I could then go and pick up the actual supersonic contract as well as the Carmen line contract, giving me quite a lot of funding to go and fly this jet plane again. This time, however, we do have our remaining two Kerbals on, and we are only flying this a day later on the 23rd of February 1964. And as you could see there, the takeoff of this was a tad wobbly. Takeoff and landing with this plane really was not the best, and that is another reason why after this flight to actually perform the supersonic contract, I don't think I'm ever going to fly this plane ever again. Nope, probably the next supersonic jet that we do fly in this series will be a prototype of the English Electric Lightning, which I have already designed, and I'm very looking forward to flying that. But right now, we do have Douglas and Mary Kerman on board here, named after Mary Ellis and Douglas Bader. Both of those were pilots during World War II, and I was really trying to find some famous UK pilots. But there you go, we can see we have actually broken the sound barrier. We've done the contract, and with that I thought, you know what, let's try and get some altitude contracts as well. And I did take this a little bit too high, to the point where the two Kerbals on board were starting to suffocate. However, we were able to come back quickly down, and I did want to see if I could break 600 meters per second with this. Unfortunately, it was not possible. I got up to about 560 before once again just flying this around. This flew maybe a lot better without the Skylark as a payload, and I really don't think I should have done that for the first launch. I just thought it might have been a little bit more interesting until I forgot that the Americans had already done that, and I'd already designed this by the point that I'd realized that. And to be honest, it didn't really add an awful lot to the mission, considering I got all of the altitude contracts with the plane that I got with the Skylark rocket anyway. But once again, we are able to touch down on the runway. The landing was not the best, and because of that landing was really why I decided, no, I'm never going to fly that again. It's too much of a death trap. I really don't want to be killing anyone, and this is when I noticed my game had broken. But luckily, a bit of a shutdown of the entire game and reloading it did bring my funding back, and with that I went and purchased the 60-ton launch pad, because I am going to need one of those in order to build my first orbital vessel, which isn't going to be Black Arrow, but it will use a lot of Black Arrow technology in order to fly. I can't use Black Arrow because I am reliant on the Waxwing solid rocket motor, which unfortunately for me is quite some ways off. But what we are going to be launching now is our Kármán line rocket. This is going to be Skylark, and actually, having been to the Leicester Space Centre in the UK quite recently, I saw this in real life, and it is so much larger than I could have ever anticipated. It looks tiny on screen, but when I saw it in real life, it's giant. It absolutely dwarfed me, so it was quite a fascinating experience seeing this in real life, and this was probably one of my favorite things to see because I just was completely taken aback. But despite the weird launch from the rooftop of that building, because I covered up the launch pad with a Kerbal Constructs building, we were still more than capable of breaking the Kármán line, and quite well as well. This actually achieved about 267 kilometers in altitude, even with that rather unconventional launch. But alas, this Skylark rocket was not long for the world, because I didn't put any parachutes or protection on it, so it exploded upon hitting the ground. However, with that contract complete, I gained a rather large amount of funding and enough science to put 1 point into my R&D. But more importantly, it unlocked the 3,000 kilometer downrange contract, which I picked up instantly. With the money that I gained, I decided it was time to actually start buying some engines, and I unlocked the Gamma 201, which is going to be the engine used on the first stage of the Black Knight rocket. Here I was trying to figure out exactly why I launched from the rooftop of the building in the previous launch, not realizing that there was a little button that I was missing on Kerbal Construction Time. This is a little bit of an older install of RP1, and I know on more recent installs there is a very handy location button. Unfortunately, I don't have that. I actually have to go into the craft itself and designate its launch site. But now that I know this, it does mean that we shouldn't have any more janky launches from rooftops. With the remaining money, I decided to upgrade upgrade mission control so I could pick up even more contracts, and then placed everything else into my build queue. Despite this, the 60-ton launch pad is still going to take 240 days, which is quite a long time if I'm going to be honest. One advantage though of placing all of my points into my build queue is that the Black Knight was constructed in little over a month. And so on the 15th of May 1964, the Black Knight II was rolled out to the launch pad to see just how far we can send nuclear warheads scientific payloads downrange. This is called the Black Knight II because it was the second design of this that I did. The first design actually only used one stage and was sort of capable of completing 3,000 kilometers downrange with just a single Gamma 201. However, I decided to add the Cuckoo upper stage in order to propel it just a little bit further, because without that, the margins were a little bit tight for my liking. The Black Knight, however, is capable of launching from the pad at Woomera Space Center and begins its long journey downrange. Historically, this rocket was actually designed for testing re-entry capabilities. The upper stage would re-enter the atmosphere and then hopefully it would survive, and it was more of a test, I believe, to see if a nuclear warhead could survive being launched on top of a missile like this. Obviously, we're not going to be doing that. What I would like this to do is to get as far as it possibly can. And the rocket itself is using a Gamma 201 on the first stage, which is the first real British engine that I have been using. Obviously, there aren't that many British engines at the start of the RP-1 tech tree, so I've been trying to model the rockets that I have been flying around what they look like in real life, but I have had to borrow some engines from other places, as is with the case of the upper stage of this as well. Historically, it was a solid rocket booster, however, I had none in the tech tree that could match anything near what it would be able to do in real life, so I have stolen an Aerobee. But the Gamma 201 that I have used to begin with is going to be very nice for future launches, because the Black Arrow will be using a set of engines called the Gamma 2 and the Gamma 8, and the Gamma 201 or 301, depending on which upgrade of it that you have, actually will give you test data for those engines. So because I am flying this on my 3,000 kilometer downrange rocket, that does mean that when I use Black Arrow technology later, hopefully test flight, or test light I think as it is on this install, will be a little bit nicer to me. But we can see that we did reach that 3,000 kilometer downrange milestone. But unfortunately, the re-entry capabilities of Cuckoo left a lot to be desired, as it disintegrated upon entering the atmosphere. With that contract now out of the way, I gained an awful lot more funding and the ability to pick up the first artificial satellite contract. I actually decided just to pick up the first scientific satellite contract because I knew that I would probably be able to do that at the same time. And it turns out, if you pick up the first scientific satellite contract, you get the first artificial satellite contract for free. So despite only being able to have 2 contracts right now, I have somehow managed to end up with 3 active ones. Picking up those 2 contracts gave me an awful lot of money, which I used to upgrade my tracking station, and then I poured once again loads of points into my vehicle assembly building, into the build queue for the VAB. I now have a grand total of 30 points in the VAB, which means that the 60-ton launch pad is going to be completed in about 160 days, and the advance of funding received was more than enough to upgrade the CSC's avionics units and build and tool the first attempt at getting to orbit, the Black Duke, with its payload Caliban, so named after the character from Bill Kerman's work, The Kraken. But whilst the CSC has been working on getting just a simple satellite to orbit, some news from the Soviet Union has developed. They have announced a successful test launch of the world's biggest rocket to date, a behemoth designated as the N1. With the successful test, the Soviets are certainly one step closer closer to achieving their goal of winning the race to the moon. However, reports do indicate that NASA and the Astral Foundation are hard at work on their own super heavy lift vehicle, the Saturn V. These announcements have made the Commonwealth Space Commission very envious of the capability of the other two nations. However, we are still stuck with just launching sounding rockets for now. And on the 6th of June 1964, Skylark II, with a small biological payload, is launched. This is pretty much identical to the first Skylark launch that I did earlier on in this episode, except this time I am actually launching it from its correct launch pad. We go straight up and we are going to attempt to send this biological payload up to above space and then return it successfully. I do have parachutes involved this time, so we shouldn't hopefully go smashing into the ground at ridiculous speeds. I did also forego the solid rocket booster on the first stage because that was not required. However, one problem with this is I did upgrade my avionics before launching this, and that made them considerably lighter, and I did not test out the new design, which caused the rocket to tip when it was almost depleted of its fuel. And unfortunately, we did not even break the Kármán line, so this contract was a little bit of a failure. I will build another one of these and launch these in the next episode, but for now, all attention is going to be focused on the first orbital rocket, Black Duke. The only reason why I launched this Skylark was because the 60-ton launch pad was going to be finished a little bit later than Black Duke would have been, so I needed to fill out the time somehow. At least I managed to get a good test of the parachutes with this mission though, so not all in vain. I did, however, gain a little bit of science from that biological payload, which is a nice little boost, although I'm still some ways off of being able to research anything new. All of the technology for me right now is rather expensive, with just using sounding rockets to gain the science. Hopefully, with the construction of Black Duke 1, I will be able to start researching things. But now, after a rather large time warp all the way to October, the orbital rocket is nearly complete. And just like that, it is. I select the Woomera 60-ton launch pad and we begin to roll this out. Obviously, things take a long time early game RP1, which is why my episodes are currently on a yearly basis. On the 17th of October 1964, the Commonwealth Space Commission prepares to launch its first satellite into space, Caliban 1, on top of a Black Duke launch vehicle. This is based upon the Black Prince design by E of Pi, which uses a black arrow on top of a blue streak. This is a little bit smaller though, in order to fit on the 60-ton launch pad. And because this is a smaller launch vehicle, that is why it is designated the Black Duke rather than Prince. A Duke is a lesser title than a Prince. Essentially, the only differences for this are that it uses one single RZ-2 engine on its first stage, rather than the two that would be found on a Blue Streak rocket. I am fully aware as well that the RD-108 mount on this does look a little bit janky, but don't worry, later on in this episode I will be going in and designing an actual Blue Streak, which will have a much better boat tail. After the Blue Flash stage has been completely drained of all fuel, the Black Arrow 1 stage fires up, using the Gamma 8 engine to propel the rest of this rocket towards space. Yes, I could not launch an actual Black Arrow because lacking the Waxwing solid rocket motor meant that I would not have had the Delta V requirements to get anything to space, so I gave it a little bit of a boost with the Blue Flash stage instead. But now the payload fairing has been deployed and we can see Caliban 1 for the first time. This satellite is based upon Prospero, which was the first British satellite launched by a Black Arrow from Woomera. With Black Arrow 1 completely depleted of all fuel, the Black Arrow 2 stage ignites, using the Gamma 2 engine to propel this satellite into its final orbit. This satellite is very, very capable. Obviously, having quite a bit of a tech boost, I did not have to worry about using weak solar panels or weak avionics. No, this satellite, once it's in orbit, will be able to last forever. I did want to make it look a tad more like Prospero, which is basically the design that I've gone for here, except that it has another layer of solar panels more in the middle. However, that would have been quite expensive to design. I really needed to get the expenses down just so the build time of this wasn't ridiculously long, but after a short while, the Black Arrow has made it to space. Caliban 1 is the first ever artificial British satellite. Connection to the ground is good, and Caliban 1 is communicating telemetry back down to Woomera Space Center. Although we are picking up a few strange signals, one from the US and one from the Soviets. Unaware, this satellite somehow is tuning in on some of their frequencies. In reality, this was just a small bug where for some reason, despite having all electric charge depleted from Beardy's and N9 satellites, I was still somehow managing to communicate with them. This will be all fixed in the next episode though, as we have a fix for that issue now. But with Caliban 1 now in space, I decouple it from the top of Black Arrow, activate all of the scientific equipment on board, and wait with it in space for a couple of days to ensure that the first artificial satellite contract and the first scientific satellite contract are both completed. And with that, I gained an awful lot of money. And science as well. Once again, I got enough science to put another point into Kerbal construction time. Then I came into mission control to pick up the polar satellite and the solar powered satellite, both of which can also be achieved with the Black Duke launch vehicle. After this, I upgraded a few of the buildings at the Space Center, as well as started building a 150-ton launch pad. And now finally, with the science that I gained from my first orbital vehicle, I could come into research and development and pick up 1961 orbital rocketry and early interplanetary avionics and probes tech. Yes, it's been an entire episode and this is the first research that I've picked up, but hopefully now that we are capable of getting orbital, I should be able to get quite a bit more science. And finally, of course, the last thing that I'm going to be doing around the Space Center is pouring an awful lot of points into my build queue and R&D now, as I do actually have some technology to research. At this point in time, news of the Commonwealth Space Commission's success has obviously spread across the world, and several countries from Europe are proposing a joint venture, combine their nation's resources and form a new agency. Original names thrown out include ELDO and ISRO, the European Launcher Development Organization, or the European Space Research Organization, but after some time, a name is finally settled upon: the European Space Agency, or ESA for short. The last few minutes of this video are now going to be spent entirely in the vehicle assembly building, where I am going to be working on the Blue Streak. I did mention that I did want to do this earlier on in the video and essentially fix the really janky boat tail that the Blue Flash, the smaller version of the Blue Streak, did have. And now, having seen this in real life, although that being said, I designed this before going to see it, I had some better idea of how to build this. So I think I may still go back and make a few edits just to make it look a little bit better still, but I really wanted to design this rocket, mostly because I will be using this for the Black Prince, which will be an uprated version of the Black Duke and should be able to achieve things like lunar impactors, which will be very nice for the coming episodes. But also, I do want to make the Europa rocket, which was the rocket featured in the small clips that I just played. It was a joint venture between Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, using the Blue Streak as the first stage, the Vexin second stage, and then the Asterisk third stage. It's not very capable, so I'm not entirely sure how many of these I will be building, but it will create a framework for the next series of rockets that the European Space Agency will be developing. Essentially, I will be carrying on the Europa series, but merging it into the Ariane 1 series of rockets all the way through to Ariane 4. I will be naming them after the Europa though, because I think that's quite a nice little touch, and I know J Ceratops was very keen on me doing that. The rocket in real life itself was quite a bit of a spectacular failure, with 11 attempted launches and only 4 of them actually working. So hopefully in this series I have a little bit of a better success rate than Eldo ever did. I do just want to point out I won't be doing that many build sections in these episodes because I've already designed the vast majority of the rockets that I will be using, at least for some time. And obviously build sections in RO, there's so many different things that you have to be concerned about that a lot of the time it just looks like a complete mess. I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I was coming in to build this, which is why I kept it in. But that is now going to be the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed my entry into For All Kerbalkind. Make sure you check out what the Soviets and the US have been up to, and until the next one, I have been Karnasa, and I will see you later. I couldn't have a first episode without leaving some blooper B-roll footage in at the end, and this was me trying to get cinematics of the Black Duke and failing spectacularly.